A room built from cold green stone lies deep underground. No windows, no echoes, only a spiral staircase made of rotting wood, descending like a thread unraveling into the pit of hell. The last person who exited that place no longer had a recognizable face, skin flayed down to the third layer, teeth shattered like gravel. But the most disturbing detail was his expression, not pain, not rage, only a blank stare, as if he had made peace with something no human should. They say the room was designed by Queen Isabella I of Castile herself, a chamber of 7 descending levels, each dedicated to a distinct form of pain, physical, spiritual, existential. But few remember Isabella that way. History prefers to speak of her as the woman who united Spain, the devout Catholic, the queen who sponsored Columbus. It is more convenient that way. Yet, Isabella was not a queen by inheritance. She took the crown by precision, by calculation, by waiting, and by removing every obstacle in silence. The world she ruled, 15th century Spain, was caught between the dying shadows of the medieval age and the faint glimmer of the Renaissance. Light was coming, but not for everyone. For Jews, Muslims, and anyone whose beliefs drifted from Rome's grip, the darkness never really left. It just changed clothes from animal pelts to crucifixes. Isabella did not see this as contradiction. To her, faith was not a matter of choice, it was duty. And those who rejected that duty were not sinners. They were waste impure elements to be incinerated, for the health of the nation. The irony? She is still remembered as a reformer, a woman who dared to defy arranged marriage and chose Ferdinand of Aragon for love. But behind that love story, she signed the Edict of Expulsion. All Jews must convert or leave Spain. 200,000 people fled in a single summer. Thousands more were arrested, tortured, burned sometimes based on nothing more than a neighbor's rumor. But the chamber wasn't meant for them. It was not part of the official machinery of the Inquisition. It bore no papal stamp, no legal warrant, only silence and blood. One of her attendants, whose name appears only in fragmented, ciphered manuscripts, described it as Her Majesty's Laboratory of the Soul. Those selected for it were not necessarily guilty. Sometimes it was a maid who spoke out of turn, a nobleman with wandering eyes, a priest who smiled too long. The criteria were invisible and final. They were taken through a passage that led from the Queen's private quarters, sometimes after a banquet, sometimes after morning prayer. No warning, no goodbye. The room had many names: the Silent Hollow, the Baptismal Hollow, the 7 Steps of the Soul, but in the royal black records, it was simply called Stage 7. No one ever made it through all 7. One man reached the 6th, a Dominican friar. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, but blood ran from his eyes like the tears of a statue of the Virgin. Isabella never stepped inside the chamber, but she had a small window built on the highest level of the palace. From there, she could see the figures being led down, step by step, as if sleepwalking into a dreamless night. They say she stood there at dawn, every day, before the sunlight grew strong enough to melt the frost, her face pale, her breath steady, always clutching a wooden crucifix in her right hand. Once, a guard asked why she stared so long at that passage. She replied, "I'm not watching them. I'm watching who I would become if I betrayed God." That's when people began to understand. The chamber wasn't just for her enemies. It was her mirror, a ritual, a purification. She was a queen, yes, but also a lamb. And the screams from the depths to her were hymns of the purest faith. We may never know how many entered that place. There are no records, no graves, only whispers in the dark, and cracks in the stone walls that still bleed when the rain falls just right. But the story did not begin with the chamber. That was only the final note. The nightmare began with light, with the coronation, with the moment she became the most powerful woman in Western Europe. A woman in white, climbing the steps to her throne, as bells rang and a sea of nobles cheered, all eyes fixed on her. None saw the frozen gleam behind her pupils, the gleam of something long prepared. Waiting, watching, below. It was said the palace smelled of roses, polished floors, crystal goblets, 1,000 candles casting their golden warmth on silk tapestries. But perfume, no matter how strong, does not cleanse rot. And in the court of Queen Isabella, rot did not come from filth, it came dressed in velvet, whispered prayers, and walked upright in broad daylight. The Queen's court was praised across Europe for its refinement. Visitors from Florence and Rome noted its libraries, its tapestries, its scholars, its quiet discipline. But under the surface, something colder pulsed, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen and report. Loyalty was not assumed. It had to be proven, again and again, and proof was never silent. Those who failed to convince were not shouted at, not publicly denounced. They were simply gone, their chairs removed, their names erased from documents, their rooms scrubbed clean before sunset. In this polished, hollow machine of rule, the most delicate operations occurred farthest from light, and so the chamber below became necessary. It was never called that aloud, of course. But everyone knew. Not all were taken by force. Some entered willingly, or thought they did, a new, noble family, hoping for the Queen's favor, a priest who claimed divine visions, a lady-in-waiting who smiled too freely at Prince John. At first, they were invited to a private conversation, a special audience, an honor. They descended through corridors that curved like intestines, smooth walls, no torches, just lanterns placed precisely so that shadows fell always behind you, never in front. The first level was deceptive. It resembled a chapel, an altar, a crucifix, a bench, incense burning softly. A monk, real or trained to be one, asked them questions about their soul, about regret, about secrets. The voice was low, tender, but persistent, like a needle searching for nerve. Then came water, and time, and the scraping away of silence. The Queen's logic was brutal in its clarity. Truth was not what people said, it was what they confessed under pain. Not immediately, not theatrically, but slowly, reluctantly, in exhaustion. The kind of truth that emerged when language began to break down and the body became the only source of sound. But this was not cruelty for its own sake, at least not officially. Her Majesty believed that sin lived not in action, but in potential. A man who had not betrayed her yet could still do so. That meant danger, that meant impurity, so it had to be extracted. Not punished, removed. Those chosen for the chamber often had no idea what they had done. That was the point. Guilt didn't matter, faith did, and faith was proven by endurance. The second level tested that faith. A man was hung upside down in perfect silence, eyes open, staring at a flame that never flickered. Beneath him, a basin of water. Drops fell from his body, blood, sweat, tears, and slowly, drop by drop, filled it. The moment the basin overflowed, the process began again. This was not pain. This was the study of limits. Another woman, they say, was asked to sing. Only one song, a hymn she had known as a child. But every time she faltered, a tooth was pulled. By the fifth verse, she hummed blood. No one screamed in those levels. Screams were reserved for the lower ones. Meanwhile, above, life continued. The Queen attended Mass, held court, smiled, discussed grain taxes and marriage alliances, her face calm, composed, a statue of virtue. But some nights, not often, she would walk the upper balconies alone, her steps slow, her hands clasped behind her back. She would stop near the thin grate where warm air from below vented to the open night. She never lingered long, just a moment, just enough. There was a saying among the guards, "She does not hear screams, she listens for the silences between them." What was most terrifying about Queen Isabella wasn't her rage, it was her stillness, that gaze that did not shift when others flinched. That unwavering sense that her path was straight even as it cut through the spines of thousands. Her chamber was not a dungeon, it was a reflection of her belief, of her conviction, of the sacred order of things. And the order demanded sacrifice. The church did not object. Why would it? She gave them power, inquisition, land, purity, and in return they gave her blessing, incense and blood bound by prayer. Some whispered that the Queen's own confessor had once been lowered to level 3 after hesitating too long in absolution. He returned with torn palms, swollen eyes, and a permanent tremor. But he confessed, and kept his place. Each level, each step down, did not bring greater chaos, it brought greater precision. Pain was applied not as punishment, but as architecture, a blueprint, designed to strip away everything but obedience. By the time they reached level 4, most no longer asked why. They asked only, when will it end? But it did not end, not truly, because those who were released, few as they were, did not leave. They remained inside, even when walking free, their backs straight, their eyes downcast, their speech slow, as if every word had to pass inspection before leaving their mouth. One of them, a court musician, survived level 5. He played again in the Queen's Court 2 weeks after his return, but his hands shook, his music was slower, his fingers bled silently onto the strings. When asked what had happened, he only said, "I was shown what harmony means." The Queen applauded. He was no longer a musician, no longer a servant, no longer a man, in the sense others were. He had been hollowed out carefully, without blood, as if the soul had been plucked from him like a splinter. And what remained was still functioning, breathing, smiling even, but no longer choosing. He stood before her and played. His fingers trembled, his eyes fixed on the marble floor. When the string snapped, he did not flinch. He simply tied another, slower than before, deliberate, silent. No one mentioned the way his gait had changed, or how his speech had grown flat, devoid of rhythm, as if each word cost him something. But perhaps it was fitting. In a court where the highest virtue was obedience, transformation was the greatest proof of loyalty. There were those who said the chamber was a myth, that such a place could not exist, that no ruler, not even Isabella, would condone such barbarism. But myths do not leave bruises, and superstition does not bleed from the eyes. More than one servant was found weeping silently by the laundry basin, their fingers stained red with lie, not from the work, but from the memory of something seen, something heard, something unspoken. What terrified them wasn't what they had endured, it was what they had watched others endure without intervention, without protest, without a single sound from above. Because silence was the true currency of the palace. And silence, in time, becomes culture. Children born within the palace walls learn to speak softly, to keep their hands visible, to never ask questions. They memorize the names of saints, the phrasing of confession, the meanings of small nods and sideways glances. They were fluent in absence. Even the tapestries changed. Once filled with bright depictions of angels and kings, they began to darken subtler tones, more sorrowful figures, saints whose faces bore lines too deep for youth. A subtle shift. No edict declared it, but everyone adapted. In this environment, love was treason. To feel strongly about anyone, anything was a danger. It opened doors in the mind, doors that might one day ask, why? And why was the most dangerous question in Castile. So people loved quietly, if at all, in glances, in routines, in the placement of a cup, in a pause between lines of scripture. Because even the appearance of disloyalty, not its proof, merely the shadow of it could invite a dissent. And no one returned the same. There was a young knight once, 21 years old, descended from one of the northern provinces. He had written poetry, love poems, mostly, but he had shared them with a lady-in-waiting. And someone had overheard. He disappeared for 9 days. When he returned, he no longer wrote. He stood straighter, spoke less, married, as instructed, within the year, produced 2 children, both of whom were enrolled in ecclesiastical schools by the age of 5. He lived to the age of 62 and never once left the palace grounds. When he died, his journal was found. In it, just one line, repeated over and over. Stone does not dream. By then, people no longer questioned why the Queen's court produced so few artists, so few thinkers, so few rebels. It simply wasn't in the soil anymore. Some said this was proof of her success, that Isabella had purified the nation from within. Others weren't so sure. They remembered a different Spain. Messy, alive, rife with contradictions, yes, but vibrant, filled with laughter that didn't echo first in fear, a land where music didn't sound like apology. But such memories faded quickly in a court where remembering was a dangerous act. And so the silence grew. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of pressure, the silence that holds just before bone snaps. And no one dared speak of the chamber anymore. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was known too well. They understood now. The chamber was not beneath the palace. It was the palace. The floors above the halls, the sanctuaries, the bedrooms and balconies were simply layers stacked atop it, echo chambers for its logic, repetitions of its design. The real descent was not a staircase. It was policy, ritual, tone of voice, eye contact, marriage arrangements, baptismal names, the length of sleeve cuffs, the pacing of prayers. Every inch was part of it, and everyone was already inside. A priest once asked her, during confession, if she ever feared judgment. If, when the veil thinned in the hour before dawn, she heard footsteps behind her. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she traced the rim of her chalice with one finger. And then she said, "Number, because I never stopped walking forward." No one spoke after that. He left the booth and was never seen again. Sometimes, even today, historians ask, what drove Isabella? Was it trauma, faith, power, some combination of all three? But perhaps it doesn't matter. Some engines don't need reasons. They just run. Faith requires sacrifice. That was the belief. That was the structure. Not spoken aloud, of course not in sermons or proclamations, but it was built into the stone, into the pace of the servant's steps, into the cool distance of the queen's eyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not carry a sword. She did not need to. Power that must announce itself is already failing. Real authority is quiet, slow. It seeps in like oil into cloth, permanent, scentless, and hard to trace. By the time Spain became pure, no one could remember what impure had felt like. The fourth level of the chamber was where purity became ritual. It was said to be the coldest. Not because of temperature, the walls were heated by stone conduits laid cleverly by Moorish builders centuries earlier. No, the cold came from something else, something deeper. The level was almost empty, just a chair, a single lantern, and a voice. Not a shout, a whisper, a repetition. The same sentence, spoken over and over, by a hooded figure seated across from the prisoner. The sentence changed depending on the sin. It might be, "You are not worthy," or "He is watching," or "There is no soul." It was not the words that mattered. It was the sound, the rhythm, the erosion. Those who sat there long enough began to respond, first with protests, then pleas, then questions, finally stillness. A night once lasted 17 hours before weeping, not because he believed the sentence, but because he no longer remembered what he had believed before. The chamber did not require screams. It preferred surrender. The queen, meanwhile, was drafting new edicts. She was negotiating alliances, baptizing indigenous people she had never met, and reading letters from a man across the sea who claimed to have found golden souls in equal number. But her eyes, those sharp and unblinking eyes, always returned to matters of order. There was a phrase she repeated often, one that appears in multiple documents and letters. Disobedience is not loud, it is quiet, it begins in the soul, and that is where it must be ended. Not punished, not erased, ended. And so the chamber remained beneath the palace, beside it, within it as a place where souls were adjusted. But who adjusted whom? That question, whispered once by a young page and overheard by the wrong person, led to his quiet removal from court. No explanation, no reassignment. His bed was given to another boy before nightfall. Rumor said he had been taken to level 5. The 5th level was darker, not in light, but in language, because here, words were taken away entirely. No speaking, no sound, only gesture, image, symbol. A prisoner might be shown a mask, one that resembled their own face, but damaged, or a mirror covered in ash, which they would be made to clean, over and over, though no reflection ever appeared. One woman was given a doll, small, wooden, its face identical to hers. Every hour, a finger was broken from it. When the last snapped, she laughed. Once, then never again. They called this the level of reflection. But nothing reflected here, everything absorbed. Meanwhile, above ground, art changed. Religious paintings began to show more anguish, crucifixes more twisted. Eyes in portraits looked slightly away, as if unsure they wanted to be painted. Even music shifted slower rhythms, minor keys, pauses between phrases. No one ordered this, but it happened. Because trauma has taste. A city in fear does not build cathedrals, it digs tunnels. One architect began construction on a chapel with 7 concentric rooms, each deeper, smaller, darker. He claimed it was inspired by divine revelation. He was later arrested for heresy. The Queen herself said nothing about the structure, but a note in the royal archive, unsigned but written in her private cipher, reads, "He saw too much, but poorly." Faith, in her view, was not illumination. It was alignment, and alignment required pain. Because without pain, how does one know they have changed? At level 6, the body no longer cried. It had nothing left to lose. This is where memory began to bleed. And yet, some survived. One man emerged from level 6 after 9 days. He had entered as scholar. He left something else. He no longer spoke any known language. He wrote in symbols no one could decipher. He would scream at sunlight and whisper to dogs, but when Isabella saw him from her balcony, she simply nodded. "He has returned to the beginning," she said. Others did not return at all, not because they died, but because they ceased. There is no burial for someone who no longer has a name. There is no mourning for someone who no longer has a face. The chamber did not take lives. It emptied them. And that was enough. The staircase to the 7th level was narrow, steeper than the others, unlit. There was no guide, no guard, just the prisoner, alone, not bound, not dragged. They walked. Always voluntarily, or so the records claimed. The truth was simpler. By the time one reached the threshold of the 7th level, the idea of resistance had already dissolved, not through threat, but through subtraction, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the will that last, delicate thread was no longer necessary. The Queen never watched level 7. Not even through her grate. Not even during dawn. She said it was not her domain, that only God could see what happened there, but she designed it. That much was certain. The blueprints, recovered centuries later, were drawn in her hand, precise, minimal, with annotations in Latin and Castilian, measurements for walls, ventilation, angles of slope, and 7 numbers, each enclosed in a perfect circle. No doors separated the levels, only thresholds, markers of descent, not boundaries of space. The idea was not containment, it was graduation. Because the chamber was never a prison, it was a school. The 7th level was the final lesson. There are no confirmed descriptions of what existed there, no official testimonies, no diagrams, only fragments, words scribbled in margins, paintings left unfinished. Dreams described by people who'd never seen it or claimed they hadn't. But one sentence appears again and again in different languages, among different sources. He entered as a man and left as a mirror. Whatever happened on that final level did not break the body. It erased it. At least, that's what survivors claimed. Though, survivors is a generous term. They were not returned to court. They were not mentioned again, but some were seen, briefly, on the periphery, silent figures in grey robes, standing in archways, watching, always watching. Some said they were monks. Others believed they were shadows. The Queen had names for them. Not proper names, she never gave people names after level 7. She gave them functions. Witness, vessel, reminder. They did not speak. They did not kneel. They simply existed. When asked, she would say, "They carry what others could not." Most believed her. A few did not. One ambassador from Venice once confronted her during a feast. He was drunk, and foreign, and foolish. He mocked the chamber, called it theatre, said pain was a poor substitute for law. She said nothing in reply. Instead, she offered him a tour. He accepted. He was never seen again. His ship sailed home without him, his quarters sealed, his name removed from the registry. Spain and Venice maintained cordial relations. A new ambassador was sent, younger, quieter. It was around this time that the palace staff began to change. New servants, new guards, fewer conversations, more glances, instructions passed in writing. Rituals began small at first, then more structured. The lighting of candles at dusk, the washing of hands before entering certain halls, the tracing of crosses on doors with oil no one recognized. The Queen said it was to protect against plague. But no one was ill. Still, they obeyed, because by then, the chamber had changed. It was no longer beneath them. It was above. In their rituals, their thoughts, their daily repetitions, it had become internalized. Isabella rarely mentioned it anymore. She didn't need to. The mechanism had become self-sustaining. A system without gears. A god without sermons. Her priests wrote treatises about spiritual alignment. Her bishops preached purity through silence. Her soldiers practiced penance before battle. Even her executioners prayed before raising the axe not for mercy, but for precision. The Queen's chamber had become the spine of the kingdom, and the kingdom stood straighter for it. But some whispered differently. That something had bent, quietly, subtly, irreversibly. That a silence this deep could only lead downward. That perhaps it had never been about purity at all. Perhaps it was hunger, not for blood, not even for obedience, but for erasure, the clean kind. The kind you don't notice until it's too late. And by then there's no one left to remember what came before. Only the chamber, and the cold, and the Queen still walking forward. There was one who remembered. He had been a boy when the chamber was still spoken of in lowered voices and unfinished sentences, too young to be chosen, too quiet to be noticed. His name was scrubbed from the palace records long before he was old enough to understand what names meant, but he remembered voices, and colors, and a hallway where light bent sideways for no reason. He became a scribe. They thought it was safe. Scribes copied what they were told. They did not interpret. They did not speak. They were hands, not minds, fingers, not eyes. But he read. Quietly, obsessively, behind curtains, between margins. And the more he read, the more the silence started to hum. Not scream, not whisper. Just hum. It lived in the patterns, in the repeated phrases, in the identical signatures on different decrees, in the way certain passages had been struck out with the same angle of ink again and again, over decades. He began to copy those patterns too. First in charcoal, then in wax. Eventually, he used a needle on parchment soaked in vinegar, a method not taught, not sanctioned. And the images that emerged weren't symbols. They were echoes. Not of words. Of movement. One drawing depicted a woman standing in a doorway, her hands folded behind her back, her feet slightly apart, her gaze tilted downward. It was labeled nothing, but those who saw it knew. It was her, not as queen, as design. A shape within shapes. A presence within policy. The scribe grew older, but no one noticed. The palace had stopped aging decades earlier. The tapestries remained untouched, the floors polished, the incense lit on schedule. Only the shadows deepened not from the sun, but from the eyes of those who walked beneath it. Even Isabella changed. Not in appearance. Her face remained a smooth monument, her posture precise, her gestures rehearsed, but her voice, once soft and assured, began to fade, not weaken, disappear. She spoke less. Then rarely. Then not at all. It didn't matter. Orders continued. Laws passed. Armies moved. The machinery remained oiled. The chamber still breathed. Some say she had transcended language. That she no longer needed words to rule. That her will had become embedded in the fabric of things, a form of divine automation. Others, more quietly, believed something had been taken. Not stolen. Given. Down in level 7. Not by force. By choice. Not hers. The chamber's intent. Because if the chamber had begun as a reflection of her, perhaps now she was a reflection of it. An empty mirror. Flawless, cold, unchanging. One day, the scribe vanished. Not unusual. Palace workers often faded, assigned elsewhere, absorbed into monastic orders, lost to time. But weeks later, a single page was found beneath the altar in the Queen's private chapel, a page written in blood-dark ink, in letters almost too precise to be human. It contained only 3 words. She stepped inside. No one claimed it. The paper was burned. The room washed. The silence returned. But something shifted. Not in law, not in ritual. In breath. Servants began to wake in the middle of the night, unsure why. Guards forgot names. Priests stammered during sermons. Paintings tilted slightly, though no earthquake had occurred. When asked if everything was all right, the Queen would only nod. But her hand trembled once. Only once. It was enough. Because for the first time in 40 years, something had reached back. Not from level 7. From above. She did not die like a queen. There was no procession, no trumpet, no open casket beneath tapestries soaked in incense. She died behind a curtain in a room no one had entered for years. The room was silent, the air still, her eyes open. They said it was peaceful. But those who saw her face, the few who were allowed, disagreed. Not because it showed pain, or fear, or longing. It showed nothing. A stillness too complete to be natural. The kind of stillness found not in sleep, but in rooms that have been sealed too long, where breath forgets itself. Her body remained untouched for 3 days. No one moved her, not out of reverence, but because no one knew how. All her commands had been given in advance, her will written, her burial prepared, but the instructions were incomplete, 1 page missing, the final page, and no one dared improvise. So they waited, and during those 3 days, the palace changed. Not visibly, not structurally, but in weight, in texture. Walls absorbed more sound, doors creaked more, candles burned faster, clocks ticked unevenly. Someone tried to open the chamber. The staircase was gone. Where the entrance had been, there was now only smooth stone, unmarked, unbroken, as if it had never existed. But still, they heard things. Not screams, not whispers, just breath from behind the walls, from under the floors, from nowhere. The Queen was eventually buried, not in the cathedral, not beneath the altar, in a chamber below the eastern wing, one no longer mapped, one without candles. No inscription marked her grave. Only a circle. Perfect. Uninterrupted. A new queen took the throne. She brought light, literally. Ordered windows cut into long shuttered halls, tore down curtains, opened gardens, laughed loudly during council. But she never entered the east wing. None of them did. That part of the palace was left alone. Cleaned, but not inhabited. Lit, but not warmed. Visitors who stayed too long there reported strange dreams. Always the same. A hallway, a staircase, a voice without sound. And her. Not young, not old, just there, watching. Not with anger, not with regret, with expectation, as if waiting for someone to continue what she had started. Or worse, to remember. The silence never left. It became custom, then etiquette, then instinct. Spain modernized. Colonies rose and fell. Languages shifted. But somewhere, in some echo, her chamber remained, not as a room, as a rhythm, slow, measured, precise. The kind that does not end when the story ends. The kind that waits. Because some stories are not meant to conclude, only to continue. In silence,